It was a perfect Sunday morning in Oakwood Heights, one of the most prestigious gated communities in Beverly Hills. The sun cast golden shadows across perfectly manicured lawns. And million-dollar homes stood proudly behind ornate gates. Marcus Johnson, a 35-year-old award-winning architect, had just returned from his morning jog. His MIT alumni shirt slightly damp with sweat. As he approached his Victorian-style mansion, a property he'd personally redesigned, Marcus stopped to check his mailbox. That's when he heard the sharp, accusatory voice that would change everything. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" Karen Williams, the self-appointed guardian of Oakwood Heights and HOA president, stood on her front lawn in designer yoga wear, iPhone already recording. Her perfectly highlighted bob-cut swayed as she marched toward Marcus, her face contorted with what she probably thought was righteous indignation. "I live here," Marcus replied calmly. Already familiar with these scenarios despite his success. He dealt with similar situations throughout his career, even after designing some of the most iconic buildings in Los Angeles. "Oh, really?" Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm. "I know everyone in this community, and I've never seen you before. Which house are you supposedly breaking into?" She emphasized the word supposedly while stepping closer, her free hand already dialing security. Marcus could see curtains twitching in nearby homes. Some neighbors were already emerging onto their porches, phones raised. He noticed young Tommy from next door looking worried, mouthing "I'm sorry" through his window. The boy had often come to Marcus for help with his architecture homework. "I've lived here for 3 years," Marcus stated firmly, maintaining his composure despite the growing audience. "I'm Marcus Johnson, and this is my house at 1447 Oakwood Drive. Don't you dare lie to me." Karen's voice rose several octaves. "I'm the HOA president. And I know for a fact that house belongs to a successful architect. Security is on their way, and you'd better stay right where you are." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He designed the very security booth she was calling, along with the community center and several other homes in the neighborhood. But before he could respond, Karen's live Facebook stream had already begun. "I'm here at Oakwood Heights," she narrated dramatically to her phone, "where I've caught a suspicious individual claiming to live in our exclusive community. This is why we need stronger security measures, people. This is what happens when we let just anyone through our gates." Marcus noticed his hands were steady as he reached for his phone. Years of dealing with discrimination had taught him to document everything. He could hear the approaching sirens in the distance. And the growing crowd of neighbors created an uncomfortable tableau across perfectly trimmed lawns. Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor who often brought him homemade dumplings, stepped forward to intervene, but Karen quickly turned on her. "Stay back, Helen. He could be dangerous. His name is Marcus, and Mrs. Chen began, but Karen cut her off with a dismissive wave. 2 security vehicles pulled up, followed closely by police cars. Karen's triumphant smile grew wider as she hurried toward them, her phone still streaming. "Officers! Thank goodness you're here. This man claims he lives in that house, but I know for a fact." Marcus stood perfectly still. His architectural award ceremony photos from last month fresh in his mind, the same ceremony where he'd received recognition for designing half the buildings in this very community. He watched as Karen gestured wildly, her voice carrying across the previously peaceful Sunday morning. The first act was drawing to a close, but Marcus knew this story was far from over. As he reached for his wallet containing all the proof he needed, he couldn't help but wonder how this would end, not just for him, but for Karen and the community she claimed to protect. The tension in the air was palpable as 2 police officers approached Marcus, while Karen continued her theatrical performance for her live stream audience. Officer Rodriguez, a veteran cop with kind eyes, took the lead while his younger partner, Officer Bennett, maintained a professional distance. "Sir, we've received a complaint about a possible trespasser." Officer Rodriguez began, his tone neutral but respectful. "Could you identify yourself?" "Of course, "Officer," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He'd rehearsed this scenario in his mind countless times, though he'd hoped he'd never have to live it. "I'm Marcus Johnson, the owner of 1447 Oakwood Drive. I have my ID and property documents right here." "Don't believe him," Karen interjected, pushing forward. "I've never seen him before, and I know every homeowner in Oakwood Heights. He probably stole those documents." Officer Bennett's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, but Rodriguez shot him a warning glance. The growing crowd of neighbors had their phones out, recording every moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawn, creating an almost theatrical setting for the unfolding drama. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket, maintaining eye contact with Officer Rodriguez. "In addition to my driver's license and property deed, I have something else you might find interesting." He pulled out his phone and opened his photo gallery. "This is from last month's Architectural Excellence Awards. That's me receiving the Urban Development Achievement Award for designing the Oakwood Heights Community Center." Karen's live stream faltered slightly. He could have photoshopped those pictures. Actually, a new voice cut through the tension. Richard Martinez, the community security chief, had arrived on the scene. "Mr. Johnson designed our security booth and implemented our current security system. He's one of our most respected residents." The color began to drain from Karen's face. But she wasn't ready to back down. "Then why haven't I seen him at any HOA meetings? I'm the president, and I've never." "You mean the meetings held in the community center I designed?" Marcus interrupted calmly. "I've attended every meeting for the past 3 years, Mrs. Williams. I sit in the back row, usually next to Mrs. Chen. I've raised concerns about our community's diversity and inclusion policies several times." Officer Rodriguez was now reviewing Marcus's documents, nodding slowly. "Everything appears to be in order. Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Several neighbors had stepped forward, phones still recording, but now their cameras were focused on Karen, whose Facebook Live video was filling with critical comments. "Did you know," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering, "that I own not just this house, but also the property at 1445 and 1449? I've been renovating them as affordable housing for young architects starting their careers." Karen's phone slipped from her trembling hands. Her live stream audience watched as the device clattered to the ground, its screen cracking but still broadcasting. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "I demand to see." "No, Mrs. Williams." Officer Rodriguez cut in firmly. "What's outrageous is making false accusations and wasting police resources. We take these matters very seriously." The younger officer, Bennett, had the grace to look embarrassed. "Sir," he addressed Marcus, "would you like to press charges for harassment?" Marcus looked at Karen, who was now backing away, her yoga outfit suddenly seeming less designer and more desperate. "No," he said finally. "But I would like this incident documented. And I believe the HOA board should be made aware of how their president conducts herself." Several neighbors had begun approaching Marcus, offering support and sharing their own recordings of the incident. Mrs. Chen pushed through the crowd with a container of dumplings, muttering about that horrible woman in Mandarin. As the police prepared to leave, Karen's phone continued to broadcast her humiliation to hundreds of viewers. The comment section was exploding with hashtags. #Karen gets schooled, #architect vs Karen, #Oakwood Karen. The confrontation was ending, but the real fallout was just beginning. As Marcus watched Karen retreat to her house, he knew that Oakwood Heights would never be quite the same. The carefully maintained facade of exclusivity had cracked, revealing the ugly prejudices beneath the surface. And somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing at the corporate offices where Karen worked as a senior executive. By Monday morning, the video had gone viral. #Oakwood Karen was trending nationally, and major news networks were running the story. The pristine gates of Oakwood Heights were now flanked by news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clear California sky like mechanical flowers. Inside the Oakwood Heights Community Center, Marcus's award-winning design with its sweeping glass facades and sustainable architecture, an emergency HOA meeting was underway. The Grand Hall, usually reserved for social gatherings, was packed to capacity. Karen sat alone in the front row, her designer outfit replaced by a more subdued ensemble. Her phone, now sporting a cracked screen from yesterday's fall, remained silent. Her law firm had placed her on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, and her social media accounts were flooded with thousands of angry comments. Marcus entered the room last, accompanied by his attorney and several community board members. The whispers died down as he took his place at the podium, the morning light streaming through the geometric windows he designed, casting artistic shadows across his face. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm not here to demand retribution or to humiliate anyone further. I'm here to create change." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. These are the demographic statistics of Oakwood Heights over the past decade. The graph showed a stark lack of diversity in the community. And these, he clicked again, are the rejected housing applications, categorized by race and ethnicity. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as the data told its story. Karen shifted in her seat, her usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. As both an architect and a resident, Marcus continued, "I've witnessed systematic discrimination masked as maintaining community standards. Yesterday's incident wasn't isolated, it was a symptom of a larger problem." He then revealed his master plan. The 3 properties he owned weren't just for young architects. They were part of a larger initiative to create an inclusive community housing program, supported by some of the biggest names in architecture and urban development. "I've secured partnerships with 5 major architecture firms," he announced, displaying logos of prestigious companies. "They've committed to funding diversity initiatives in our community, including scholarships for minority students in architecture and urban planning." The room erupted in applause, led by Mrs. Chen and several other longtime residents who had witnessed the community's resistance to change. Karen finally stood up, her voice trembling but determined. I would like to say something." The room fell silent again as she made her way to the podium. Marcus stepped aside, maintaining his dignified composure. "I was wrong," she began, tears forming in her eyes. "Not just yesterday, but for years. I've hidden behind rules and regulations to maintain what I thought was order, but I was really perpetuating discrimination." Her confession continued, detailing years of subtle and not so subtle exclusionary practices. As she spoke, many residents nodded in recognition of their own complicity in maintaining these barriers. The meeting concluded with unprecedented changes: Karen's resignation as HOA president, the establishment of a diversity and inclusion committee, and the unanimous approval of Marcus's community housing initiative. As people filed out of the hall, Marcus remained behind, studying the architectural plans he'd drawn up years ago for this very building. The original concept had always been about bringing people together, breaking down barriers through design. A local news crew caught up with him outside. "Mr. Johnson, how does it feel to transform your community through architecture and activism?" Marcus smiled, gesturing to the building behind him. "Architecture isn't just about designing spaces, it's about creating possibilities. Sometimes it takes a catalyst to reveal the true structure of things, both physical and social." As the cameras rolled, residents gathered on the community center's steps for a group photo. The image would later become symbolic of Oakwood Heights' transformation, Marcus in the center, surrounded by a diverse group of neighbors, with Karen visible in the background, beginning her journey toward understanding and redemption. The story was far from over, but the foundations for change had been laid, stronger than any concrete or steel Marcus had ever worked with. 3 months after the incident, Oakwood Heights had become a case study in community transformation. The autumn leaves painted the neighborhood in warm colors as residents gathered for the first ever Oakwood Heights Cultural Festival. held on the sprawling lawn of Marcus's newly renovated community complex. The aroma of diverse cuisines wafted through the air: Mrs. Chen's dumplings, Mr. Patel's samosas, and traditional barbecue from Marcus's family recipe book. Children played on the inclusive playground he'd designed, while their parents mingled, sharing stories and building genuine connections. Karen's house, now bearing a sold sign, stood as a quiet reminder of how quickly life could change. She'd accepted a position in another state, but not before completing the community's mandatory diversity and sensitivity training program that she'd helped establish as part of her redemption journey. "Marcus," called out Tommy, the neighbor boy who'd watched the incident unfold months ago. Now he was leading the community's first youth architecture program, inspired by recent events. "Can you help us with our model for the new cultural center?" Marcus made his way to the group of eager young faces gathered around a table of architectural drawings. Among them were scholarship recipients from his new initiative, young talents from diverse backgrounds who might never have had the opportunity to live in such a community before. The local news crew had returned for a follow-up story. "Mr. Johnson," the reporter began, "your story has inspired similar initiatives across the country. How do you feel about being called the architect of change?" Marcus adjusted the blueprints on the table before responding. "Change, like good architecture, requires both vision and foundation. What happened here wasn't just about one incident or one person. It was about a community finally seeing its own structural flaws and choosing to rebuild." The camera panned to show the transformation: new families moving into the renovated properties, the recently installed community art wall featuring works from diverse artists, and the construction site of the upcoming multicultural center, all projects that had emerged from that fateful Sunday morning. Sarah Williams, Karen's teenage daughter, approached Marcus during the festival. She'd chosen to stay in the community with her father, and now she was one of the most active members of the Youth Diversity Council. "Mom called yesterday," she told him. "She's doing better. The therapy and her new job, she's learning. She asked me to give you this." Sarah handed him a letter. Later that evening, as the festival wound down and the sunset cast long shadows across the community he'd helped reshape, Marcus sat in his study reading Karen's letter. It was a thoughtful reflection on privilege, prejudice, and personal growth. She'd enclosed a check for the scholarship fund and an open invitation to speak at her new company's diversity training programs. Marcus placed the letter in a frame alongside other mementos from the past few months: newspaper clippings, the community's new inclusive housing policy, and a photo of the first diverse HOA board in Oakwood Heights history. His phone buzzed with a notification: another community had reached out, hoping to implement similar changes. Marcus smiled, opening his laptop to begin sketching new possibilities. The incident that could have divided them had instead become the foundation for something greater. Outside, the last festival-goers were leaving, their voices carrying messages of unity and friendship into the evening air. The security booth, the same one where everything had started, now displayed a welcome sign in multiple languages. As Marcus stood at his window, watching the community he'd helped transform, he remembered something his father used to say: sometimes it takes breaking ground to build something better. Oakwood Heights had broken ground, literally and figuratively, and from that rupture, something beautiful had grown. The lights of the community center, his design, their heart, glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. A beacon of what was possible when people chose to rebuild not just their spaces, but their perspectives. The story of Oakwood Karen had ended, but the story of Oakwood Heights' transformation was just beginning. And somewhere, in communities across the country, other architects of change were drawing up their own plans for a better tomorrow.